Hey Wolfpack, and welcome back. I hope all is well, and I hope you enjoyed your week. Today, we're finally reading more hiking stories. But first, have you had anything creepy happen while you're hiking? Comment down below, I'm very curious to know. I hope to start hiking more this spring, as well as get into urban exploring a little bit. With that said, whether you're sitting around a campfire, on the night shift, or even laying in bed, let my voice soothe your nightmares. I have always loved solitude and hiking, so naturally, when I went on a 6-week vacation to New Zealand, I went on a fair number of hikes. The most memorable one by far was the Abel Tasman Inland Track. Unfortunately, it wasn't my most memorable hike ever for its beautiful views of the surrounding nature. The reason I will never forget this hike is because it terrified me and has forever changed the way I look at the world. It all started when all of my family and friends chipped in to give me a 6-week vacation in New Zealand for my 25th birthday. I'd always wanted to go there, but I was the type who never acted out on such fantasies. Therefore, my sweet sister organized the fundraising to force me to fulfill my dream. I loved my friends and family dearly for this gift, my sister most of all, of course. Hell, despite everything, I still love all of them dearly for it. My first weeks in New Zealand were absolutely fantastic. I saw all of the Northern Island. In New Zealand, everywhere you look, or indeed snap a photo, you see the most breathtaking views of nature. The forests are huge and filled with an enormous diversity of trees, from pines to oaks and palm trees, and any sort of tree in between. The cities are great too, like Auckland, where more than 1/3 of the population of New Zealand lives, or the unique city called Rotorua, which always smells like rotten eggs, because of all of the active volcano geysers. I hiked through many of these forests and visited all the cities. I also did the touristy thing and visited Hobbiton and saw Mount Doom on the Tongariro Alpine Track. The last one also featured the most beautiful oddly colored lakes I'd ever seen and a smoke-blowing active volcano. But I digress. I'm not writing this to tell you all about my vacation. My ordeal started after a couple of nights in Wellington. A great place to party, to be honest. I woke up with an enormous hangover and missed my boat to the southern island of New Zealand. So, I took the next boat. But now, I had also missed the bus on the southern island, a bus that only came twice a day. To make a long story short, I had to start my hike the next day wholly unprepared, with my full 45 pounds of gear on my back and only one bottle of water. The Abel Tasman Inland Track starts at the same point as the Abel Tasman Coastal Track, the latter of which is one of the most popular hikes in New Zealand. The coastal track takes you around the mountain and beautiful forest over the beaches. The inland track, however, takes you right through the forest over the mountain. It is suitable for experienced hikers and is as obscure as its coastal sibling is popular. It sounded right up my alley. I started the hike, and after about an hour of walking, I reached the split into the inland track. Within half an hour, I started to think I had made a mistake. The inland track was one long, difficult path upwards. The sun was blazing, and the 45 pounds on my back felt heavier by the minute. 1 hour in, I finished my last drop of water. At least, I had the beautiful vistas to power on. Or, so I thought. Soon, I stepped into the forest. It was beautiful as well, of course. It felt like you were walking through Jurassic Park. But still, after a while, you got used to it. Dehydrated, sweaty, and sore all over, I plowed through. To make matters worse, I now had to hike through the thickest mist I had ever seen as well. They say the human body is made up of about 60% of water. Between all the fog and sweat, my body felt like it contained at least 80% of water at the time. Yet, I was still dying of thirst as well. I seriously started to question my love of hiking. Hell, I was on vacation. I could be in a nice hot spring or cozy hotel room right now. After hours of hiking uphill while cursing myself, I finally reached the first hut. This wasn't the shelter where I could sleep for the night, mind you, but it was a clear spot with a breathtaking view, and there was water. I eagerly boiled some over my camping stove, while taking a rest and enjoying the view. After the water had been boiled and cooled down enough, I filled up my bottle and drank the rest until the final drop. Re-energized by it, sun, and rest, I felt better about hiking again. Within another half hour, I hated it. Once more, I was climbing through the misty forest, and the climb was getting steeper and steeper. Eventually, I even had to climb a few parts of the trees. The only time I've ever had to do that on a hike. Sore and almost broken, I hardly noticed the path finally becoming straighter again. I did, however, notice the shelter at the end of the path. It almost looked like a mirage. I was so relieved to see it. As I came closer, I was even hit with a love for hiking harder than ever before. Never had a hike been so painful, but never had reaching a shelter felt so rewarding afterwards. You only remember the good stuff afterwards, right? How wrong I could be. The hut itself was very basic. It had 8 mattresses, a wood stove, a door, a window, and a chair. Simple and adequate, perfect for the night. It was on a beautiful spot on top of the mountain. It felt like one of the most beautiful places on earth, and I had it all for myself. Hell, come to think of it, when this night would be, I wouldn't have been around any other human being for a full 24 hours. All the earlier hardships seemed to be worth the effort by far. I gathered some firewood and enjoyed a well-deserved rest in the last hour of sunlight. Afterwards, I made a fire in the stove and heated up some beans and instant noodles. I went outside. I have never seen so many stars in the sky as I saw on top of that mountain that night. Mesmerized, I gazed at them for probably hours. When I finally got out of my trance, I decided to take a piss and go to bed. Wait, since this is a confession of something I've never told anyone before, let me be perfectly honest. Feeling good, alone, and free out in nature, I pleasured myself under the starlight. When I was about to finish, I was startled by a rustling of some trees close by. My heart began to beat very fast. I thought I was having a heart attack, to be honest. Frozen, I peered into the darkness in the direction of the trees that had made the rustling noise. There wasn't any noise anymore. It stayed eerily quiet. When my heart reached a somewhat normal rate again, I pulled up my pants and quickly went inside. I couldn't fall asleep, though. Although it had remained quiet, I still felt uneasy. Suddenly, I began to hear the faint noise of footsteps and cracking wood. The sounds came closer. It must have been an animal. Even though New Zealand doesn't have many animals, you can still find cats, possums, and deer all around, as well as a huge variety of birds, some of which, like their national pride, the kiwi, are quite big and walk instead of fly. So, it must be an animal, I told myself. I caught my own lie instantly. I've never been a good liar. The footsteps slowly circled around the house. It sounded heavier than most animals, and it sounded bipedal. I was really getting nervous now. Who could be here at this time of night? There is only one way here. Well, 2, if you count the road onward towards the next hut, of course. But still, it is a very remote area, and it is definitely not easy to reach. No one would reach the place this late at night, unless... yes, it had to be. Someone else must have chosen the inland track like me, but probably got lost in the woods, because the track is so hard to follow. I almost got lost a couple of times as well. So, yes, someone must have been lost and has finally managed to reach the shelter. I managed to somewhat convince myself of the lie this time. The best lies always contain a grain of truth, they say. The soft footsteps stopped. Frozen in bed, I strained my ears for the faintest sound. All my senses seemed oversensitive. For a while, it remained quiet. Then, the footsteps started again. This time, accompanied by a scraping sound against the side of the shelter. It was one continuous scrape that sounded like multiple things at once. The sound was horrible. It sounded like a set of claws. Petrified, I huddled under the blankets like a little kid. For an agonizing while, the scraping around the shelter continued. Then, it just stopped. After a while, I mustered up the courage to peer over the blankets. Slowly, I started to scan the room. It was very dark, but it seemed okay, and the sounds had stopped for a while. I guess it was gone, whatever it was. I hadn't noticed it with my first look around, but as I relaxed and looked around once more, I saw it. Someone was staring at me through the window. It was so dark and the figure stood so still. It was so hard to make out at first, but when I did see it, I could not unsee it. There it was, the silhouette of a face, its features most indistinguishable, but for the eyes. The horrible piercing eyes with their ink-black pupils. They were staring right at me. They seemed unhuman, and they seemed to smile. Once more, I ducked under my covers like I was 5 years old, like the covers would do me any good against whatever was staring at me outside the shelter. Still, it remained quiet. It is at times like these that the relativity of time becomes more evident than ever, because I have absolutely no idea how long I waited this time. It may have been minutes, but could also have been hours. Before, I dared to peek through the blanket. When I did, there was nothing outside the windows. There were no more sounds as well. I wasn't going to sleep any more this night. As soon as the first sunbeams of dawn would arise, I would get the hell out and hike on. If it would press on enough, and I certainly had the incentive to, I would make it past the next shelter and all the way to the end, back to civilization. I guess this prospect made me feel a lot better, because next I remember is waking up and immediately realizing I slept in pretty late. Quickly, I gathered all my stuff and got the hell out of there. The scratch marks were all over the side of the cabin. Long lines, none of them straight, but I could still make out 5 lines in a row each time. 4 lines close to each other, and the 5th one slightly higher. I moved on and didn't look back. At first, I still had the faint hope I could still reach the end of the trail that day, but the trail was even steeper and harder to climb, and the hike of the previous day. Not to mention the horrible night had made me so sore, progress was hard and slow. I soon realized I would have to sleep in the next cabin. Later, I realized how stupid I had been. I'm always so goal-oriented, I only had the end of the trail in my mind. I should have just gone back to the beginning. It would have been a downhill hike. I probably would have checked into a hostel or a hotel before dinner. Angry at myself, I pushed on. What else could I do? Great, even more trees to climb. This was the toughest hike I'd ever been on. Still, it did help to take my mind off the proceedings of the previous night. Also, truth be told, during daytime the forest didn't feel eerie. It felt peaceful, and every now and then there was a clearing and I was treated with a view worthy of a postcard in a tourist gift shop. After a while, I even began to rationalize. Perhaps it had just been a possum. The bastards are bold and have claws. Then, my mind probably played tricks on me when I looked at the window. I sort of convinced myself that that had happened. Besides, the forest felt peaceful now, so even if it was something else, it couldn't be following me now, through this hard trail during daytime. I finally felt more at ease and climbed the harder trail. It was almost dusk when I finally reached the second shelter. This shelter was larger than the first one. It wasn't placed on a clearing on top of a mountain. This one was sheltered between huge and beautiful trees. I had dinner and put some extra wood in the stove, which also functioned as a heater. For a while, I stared at the flames, hypnotized by their flickering patterns. As it turned dark, my faint hope for some fellow hikers to show up dissipated. I had looked forward to the solitude of this hike before I started it, but as the night turned darker, fear slowly crept back into me, and I could really have used some company. Thankfully, it remained quiet, however. Exhausted, I plunged into bed. I have no idea what time it was when I woke up, but I could already hear my elevated heart beating in the silence. It was coming again, and I could feel it. Sure enough, it didn't take long before I heard the footsteps approaching in the distance. As they slowly neared the cabin, breaking twigs along the way, I braced myself for the scraping. But this time, there was no scraping. The sound that followed was even worse than before. I was startled by the sound of a creaking door. the sound of the door of the cabin opening. Scared to death, I stared at the doorway. I saw the outline of a silhouette. I couldn't quite make out its features, but it seemed human. Maybe this was just another hiker arriving late. Please be another hiker. Whoever it was just stood there in the doorway for the longest time. As my eyes adjusted a little, it seemed less human than I initially thought. It was very tall and lanky. Its legs were very long and thin, compared to its relatively short torso. Its arms were also thin and long, like the arms of a primate. Suddenly, it started to move inside the shelter. Petrified, I turned around, shaking and facing the wall. I heard the footsteps move in closer as the floorboards creaked. Very close to me, I heard more creaking of wood. Then, it was silent again. I became so scared, I seriously thought I was going to faint. I wish I had. At least, I would have escaped this living nightmare. I never did faint, though. I just kept shivering, staring at the wall, and my heart kept beating through my chest, like it was trying to break a record. All the while, it remained quiet. Once more, I lost track of time. But it felt like hours when I finally resolved to take a quick peek. I slowly turned my head around to scan the room again. I didn't have to look around for long. It sat in a chair right next to me. I was so startled and petrified, both my body and mind froze right there. I could do nothing but stare. In the dim light of the glowing embers in the stove, I could finally see some of its features. It was not human. This creature was certainly akin to a human, but its thin, bony body was covered in leathery skin. Its long face was ghastly, with a long, crooked nose, pointy ears, a long chin, and huge eyes with piercing, dark pupils. But worst of all was its mouth. It was enormous and filled with way too many pointed teeth. Even worse was that it smiled at me. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just sat there in the chair, staring and smiling. It felt like I was losing my sanity and could do nothing more than stare back in shock at this demon, or whatever this creature was. Then it startled me even more. The smile disappeared and the thing stared at me menacingly. It slowly hunched forward towards me and reached out its hand. I closed my eyes and braced for the worst. It touched my head and started to stroke it. I could feel its bony, leathery fingers crawl through my hair and all over the skin of my head. I could also feel his razor-sharp claws at the end of his fingertips. Yet, the strokes were so gentle and soft, it managed not to leave a single scratch. Somehow, it made this whole ordeal feel even worse. What did it want from me? The creature stopped stroking my head, and I slowly opened my eyes. As it pulled back its hand, it smiled at me again. It slowly got up and walked to the door. As it walked out, it stood still in the doorway once more, turning its head around to face me one last time. It looked at me even more menacingly than before, and put its fingers to the front of his lips. It then made the only sound I heard it utter. In a raspy voice, it went, "Shh." It smiled at me once more, but this time, the smile was very menacing as well. It began walking away, frozen in the same position. I stared at the doorway for the rest of the night. Thankfully, whatever it was never came back. As soon as the sun started to set, I got up and sped out of the shelter. The hike was a lot easier because I had to descend the mountain again, and in record time, I reached the end. Never have I ever been so glad to see other people again. I checked into an 8-person room in a hostel and stayed away from the hikers for the rest of that vacation. As the years have gone by, and nothing alike has ever happened to me again, my fear has thankfully grown less. Believe it or not, I even started hiking again after a few years, although nowadays, I only do popular hikes. I still like some solitude during the daytime in nature, but before dusk, I want to reach a shelter and be amongst other people. No more being alone in the wild at night for me. Not now, not ever. I am an atheist, and even though I really like the paranormal, I don't really believe in any of that stuff. I think there's a rational explanation for everything, but as hard as I try, I can't think of any rational explanation for what happened to me in New Zealand. I have no idea what that creature was, and moreover, what did it want? Was it truly a kind demon? Some misunderstood creature longing for companionship? Or perhaps, more likely, something sinister. Whatever it was, it scared the shit out of me. Never before or since have I been so scared, nor had I known such fear was even possible. Hell, even now I'm writing this in the hope of giving it a resting place. Yet so far, it has only helped me to feel scared all over again. So scared, in fact, that my mind is playing tricks on me, because I've had the feeling something has been circling my house for a while, and right now, I could swear I'm hearing the scraping sound again. We'd been married for 2.5 years, Sean and I, and we never took vacations, not since our honeymoon in Greece after the wedding. Sean was a psychiatrist and loved his job. He was so committed to his work and his patients, and that's what made me fall for him in the first place. His ambition and care for others. Sean was never around much anymore. He started to spend less time at home, and even when he was there, he was always too busy to spend time with me. "Another time, Jorge," he would say, sighing from exhaustion, and my constant nagging and need for attention. I'm not ashamed to admit, I was needy. "Seriously, Sean? It's like I'm living with a stranger. Something needs to change." After nights of sitting and sleeping alone with him, I was surprised when he came home one night and said, "Let's go on a vacation." At first, I thought he was joking, so I ignored it. Passed it off as an attempt to humor me and keep me sweet, but the next day he was insistent. It was nice that Sean was suddenly taking an interest, but I was also suspicious as to why. I didn't directly question him. I didn't want to dampen his efforts. He was just trying, and that's all that mattered. "Hiking," he said, to my complete surprise. "Gives us a chance to just be, I don't know, together for a few days. I think we need it, wouldn't you agree?" It was ambitious. Hiking, I mean. Sean had never shown any interest in the great outdoors, let alone hiking, and he was so anal about his hygiene. I couldn't imagine him lasting 2 minutes in the wilderness without a power shower, and his creature comforts. Okay, I said. Giving in to his repeated attempts, he finally talked me into it. So, I tried to be optimistic. "It'll be great, exciting even. I can't wait," Sean said, before kissing me for the first time in months. It felt like things were beginning to change. I left the planning and purchasing of camping gear to Sean, mostly because I had no idea what we would actually need, and secondly to see if he would actually follow through with it. My best friend Darcy couldn't believe it when I told her. "Why the change of heart?" she said. "You've suggested a vacation so many times and he's dismissed every single one. And hiking? Rather you than me, dude." Darcy hated Sean. She had never outright told me, but she didn't need to. I saw it in her distaste for his cool, somber attitude, his negligence of our relationship, and the way he dismissed her whenever she was around. "I think he's scared of losing me," I said, convincing myself more than her. Never one for skirting around the truth, I could tell by Darcy's slight smile that she didn't agree. "I still think he's screwing someone else." I rolled my eyes. I was sick of hearing that accusation every time. About a year ago, Darcy saw Sean with another guy at a restaurant. They were cozy, content, and immersed in each other. She even managed to take pictures undetected. They proved nothing, and she saw nothing. Darcy knew of the guy Sean was with, friend of a friend, something like that, and said he was just a young guy who flipped burgers at the food stand. Not exactly someone Sean would be networking or associating with. I never told Sean. I thought maybe it was just one of his patients. A golden rule you don't break is being social with patients, though, as Sean had told me years ago, but maybe there was a reason for it, or maybe I just refused to believe it. I was at home pre-packing the car the night before we were due to leave for our trip. Perhaps it was the excitement of getting away, or my general anxiety of doing something I'd never done before. But I thought it was best to be organized. Sean was at the office. He told me he needed to finalize a few things and make sure his patients were aware he would be absent for a week. I received a phone call from Darcy after I loaded the car. "Don't go anywhere with him," she said, sounding insistent. "What? Darcy, what do you even—" She cut me off. "Jorge, I'm pretty sure that Sean isn't who he says he is." The revelation did nothing for me. No shock value, no concern either. It just sounded like another one of Darcy's attacks on Sean. I've known Sean for 4 years, Darcy. I think I know him pretty well. What are you even talking about? My friend Sabrina. She's good friends with Tommy, Burger Boy. You know the one I saw Sean with? Uh-huh. I hummed. I already knew where this was going. Tommy's dead, Jorge. He was murdered. I scoffed. Then I began to laugh. I'm serious, Jorge. You need to get out of there, Darcy yelled. You're being ridiculous, Darcy. I know you don't like him, but they were in a relationship for a year. Sabrina told me everything. Said he was violent with him and, oh, for hell's sake, open your eyes, Jorge. I've had enough. Goodbye, Darcy, I said before I hung up. We set off at 5 a.m. the next morning. I was pretty restless most of the night. I thought about how low it was of Darcy to bring a recently murdered boy into my marital problems, and her personal resentment of Sean. I couldn't imagine what Tommy's friends and family were going through, though. I read up on the mountain, I said to Sean as he drove us out of town. Grasmere Mountain was 4 hours away from home, and with how I felt that morning, it didn't seem far enough. That's good. Anything interesting? He said, concentrating on the mostly empty road. There's a lot of trails. Has a lot of wooded areas around it. There's streams with little brooks too. It looks beautiful. It was a good suggestion. Sean nodded. Great. It wasn't great. It was just a standard mountain, something I didn't particularly have an interest in, but I wanted to think about anything else other than my husband being associated with someone who was just murdered. The next thing I said, admittedly, spooked me out when I read about it. Apparently, there's an urban legend about Grasmere. Years ago, if you went up the mountain, then you never came back down. Well, let's hope that's not true, Sean said with a smile. We were well into the main trail by midday. The sun was hot, and it made me sweat profusely. Those extra pounds I'd gained at the turn of my 30s didn't do me any favors. I saw that Sean struggled as well. We'd spent most of the journey up barely speaking, only small talk and polite conversation. Do you want to take a break? I asked him, in between panting. No, come on, it's not much further. How do you know? I don't, he said with a grin. It was the most animated I'd seen him in a long time. I started to feel a lot more positive that doing this was a good idea when I saw him look like he was enjoying himself. Eventually, we were on level ground, and finally took some time out. Part of me regretted coming to Grasmere because of my dodgy knee that was flaring up from the hike, but the other part of me enjoyed the rush and achievement of making it up so high. There was still more to explore, but Sean and I decided to lay our roots down and set up camp. Are you sure we have enough food and water? I asked, as I unpacked what minimal amount of food there was. It was Sean who packed the essentials in there. He scowled at me. His mood had changed since we came off the trail. Yes, I know what I'm doing, Jorge. I'm not an idiot. I was just making sure. He appeared to be preoccupied with his thoughts as we set up the area with our tent and such. He was repetitively impatient and short with me too. Let's go for a walk, I suggested. Sean scoffed. Haven't we done enough walking? Well, we are on a walking holiday. He shook his head and looked disgusted at the suggestion. I'm fine here. You can do what you want. I'd had enough of his attitude. Sean, what the hell is wrong with you? He sat up from the log he was resting on and swung both his arms backward and forwards like he was about to do a warm-up for a workout. The smirk on his face chilled me. Nothing. I'm at peace, Jorge. And he said this whilst looking down his nose at me, like I was lower than him. At peace. What an odd thing to say, I thought. I didn't say anything else to him. I decided to walk away. I wasn't prepared to start an argument with him in the middle of nowhere. High up on a mountain of all places. The last thing we both needed was to be at war when we were stuck with each other. The woods felt damp and smelt of fresh rain, which was unusual considering the temperature the sun cast down on the ground and the clear skies above. I wondered if Sean acted dismissive because of what Darcy said to me the night before. If he was seeing that Tommy boy, like she claimed, then maybe he was grieving, felt guilty even about it. Maybe he was in love with him, or maybe it just wasn't true. I was confused, but what was clear to me was that going on the trip was going to make our marriage break. I had a feeling it would be the latter, but I made a commitment when I took my vows, something I took quite seriously, considering how long it took us to have the right to marry. I tried my best, but I had exhausted every option. I was tired of trying. Suddenly, I heard some twigs snap behind me. I ignored it the first time, but then I heard some more snapping closer to me. "Sean?" I called out, but there was no one there. Probably just a squirrel or something, I thought. I pulled my phone out and considered calling Darcy to apologize. I hated arguing with her. However, there was absolutely no signal. Of course, I sighed at my phone. I was surprised that she didn't text me or attempt to call me again after I hung up on her that night before. She was usually persistent when it came to getting her point across. When I walked back to our tent, my phone vibrated. Several text messages and missed calls from various people. A couple of friends and, to my surprise, Darcy's dad, who had left me a voicemail. Before reading the messages, I went straight to his voicemail with my heart in my mouth. For her dad to call, something had to be up. When I hit play, it was fuzzy, barely audible. "Jorge!" He was distressed. I could hear it in his voice. "It's Jeff!" He broke down, sobbing, and it was hard to hear a tough man like him cry. It only made my anxiety grow. "She's been killed! Someone murdered my little girl! Where are you? Please call me!" As soon as the voicemail finished, it was like someone had punched me in the stomach. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even cry. All the sounds around me sharpened, making my ears ring. I went completely numb. It took me a minute before I ran back to Sean. "What's the matter?" he asked, his voice one note, his face unfazed. I was out of breath. I could feel the color draining from my face, but he didn't seem concerned. In fact, he sat with a calm poise. "We need to go back," I said, pointing to where we entered, trembling all over. He cocked his head. "Why would I want to do that? Darcy's been killed. Someone murdered her." Sean stood up, rubbing his knees as he did so. He cocked his head again. "I know, babe." His tone made me freeze. He looked like a completely different person. No remorse, no urgency. What do you mean you know?" Sean sneered, then showed me his teeth. "Haven't you worked it out yet, Jorge? Or are you really as dumb as you make out? Your little BFF knew, didn't she? She just couldn't leave it alone." I wasn't dumb. I knew exactly what he was alluding to, and what he was confessing. I just didn't want to wake up from it. It was all a bad dream. I knew Sean, and I knew he couldn't have done that. Not to Darcy or Tommy, not anybody. He helped people for a living. That's what he did. He cared. But I had to wake up and face it. "The boy too?" I asked. He confirmed it with a nod. "Why?" I sighed. Sean put a hand behind his back and retrieved a knife from his belt. His mouth slowly spread into a dirty, menacing grin. "Because I like it." I didn't give myself any time to think. I just spun on my heels and ran like hell. I heard his own feet crunch the leaves. He was in pursuit of me, sprinting not too far behind. I dared myself to look back. Sean's face was crimson. The sweat dripped off him and settled into little drops on his t-shirt. I couldn't get over the hunger in his eyes, the desire like a predator chasing its prey. That's what I was to him. I directed my eyes to the knife in his hand. watched the way it swayed back and forth and reflected the glistening sun. I imagined it piercing my skin. I imagined him killing me with it. I lost my concentration by glaring at the knife. Didn't pay attention to where I was running. My sneakers stubbed a hard spot in the ground, and I hit my knee before the rest of me toppled onto the floor. The pain in my knee was excruciating, but I pushed past it and steadied myself back up, ready to continue running. I was too late. He pushed me back down, so I fell on my chin this time. Just as quickly, he turned me over to face him. His eyes widened with satisfaction as he rested his heavy weight onto my stomach. I could also feel his erect member inside his trousers. "Sean, don't! This isn't you! I love you!" My pleading was lost on him. He raised the knife up as I tried to struggle. What a frickin' shame. And that was the last thing Sean ever said to me. I didn't see it behind Sean. It must have waited patiently, maybe even witnessed the whole thing. Sean's blood splattered onto my face and my shirt. The sensation of it hitting my face made me close my eyes. It felt like they were closed longer than they actually were. The blackness was comforting for those few seconds, though. I guess it's true what they say. When you think you're going to die, your whole life does flash before your eyes. And I'd been an idiot. I should have left Sean a long time ago. I should have listened to Darcy. It was only when I opened my eyes that I saw the pickaxe went directly through the side of his skull. His eyes were still open. His body seized uncontrollably for a few seconds before it finally went limp. Then, I saw his body raise above me with the strength of the pickaxe. He was tossed to the side like a rag doll. His skull came off the pickaxe like meat on a bone. I slowly turned my head to face it. It was at least 8 feet tall. It looked like every dark, inescapable nightmare I'd ever had. The nightmare looked like a man by stature, but whatever it was not human. Its skin was a boiled pink, scattered with pink intrusions pulsating like thick veins. The face was blank. No eyes, the skeletal structure of a nose peeked through, and a mouth scattered with odd fang. The fangs dripped with saliva. I was prey again. In the time it took for me to register it, and take in its harrowing presence, I saw the pickaxe raised above me. Before it could strike down directly onto my groin, I got up and ran away, but it didn't follow. I didn't know precisely how long I'd been running for. It could have been 5 minutes, or half an hour. I wasn't keeping track. It was enough for me to make my mouth dry enough to heave. I'd also developed a wheeze, like I'd just smoked several packs of cigarettes. I finally acknowledged the throbbing pain in my knee. Before I even rubbed it, I felt the fiery heat that radiated from it. I took a gamble that I was far enough from the nightmare that I could attempt to call mountain rescue. No signal, but I chanced 911 regardless. Nothing. Instant disconnection. "For hell's sake," I said to myself. Then it occurred to me that instead of running down the mountain, I'd continued going up. I hoped I hadn't gone too far up, that I didn't lose my bearings if I attempted to get back down, and hopefully I'd also find a signal along the way. Limping, and trying to use my good leg to move, I took a look around. Coast was clear. I made use of the trees and tried to be as incognito as possible. I noticed a trail and made a plan to follow it. If I could get down as far as possible, maybe it would lead me down the mountain again, and I could make a run for it. I was about to put my plan into action when the nightmare emerged from a tree. It stood there before me and waited patiently. Even though it appeared to be blind, it could see me and sense me. That much I knew. I thought about which direction to go, to run. I gave a sideways glance to my left and saw there was a hill down below. I couldn't see how low down it was from where I stood. For all I knew, it could have been a long drop. I had to act fast. It began to move and lifted the pickaxe up. It was ready to pounce again. I had no choice, and I had to take the chance. I sprinted to my left as it mimicked my move. I couldn't believe the speed it had. I thought I would make it, and the nightmare got closer and swung the pickaxe. It was inches from my head when I jumped below. I felt the ground on the tips of my fingers, moist, probably what saved my life from the high jump. The impact when I rolled down the hill didn't do my limbs any favors. I pushed myself up and winced from the pain all over. I was lucky I didn't break anything. I got my bearings and wiped my stinging lip. Blood. I felt the spit with my tongue, which was like putting salt on it. I couldn't believe my eyes when the thing stood in the path before me. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, as I attempted to run in the opposite direction. My legs wouldn't let me run anymore. All I managed was a pathetic limp. I thought I was done for good this time. "Really? You're still trying to run?" I went cold when I recognized the voice. I turned to see Sean standing there instead of the nightmare, his arms folded, his lip curled, smug and completely unharmed. It was impossible. "You're dead," I said. "I watched you die." He tutted, shook his finger. "I'm not dead," Sean said, and proceeded to poke his finger into the side of his skull, directly where I watched it get impaled. "I'm in here. You'll always have me in your head, especially now you know who I really am. You're weak, Jorge." Sean approached me, and I didn't back away. I couldn't believe he was still alive. "You're dead," I repeated, standing my ground. "What will you do now that you have no one else to love you? I'm dead. Darcy's dead. Who else do you have?" He was inches away now, the apparition of Sean. It wasn't him. It wasn't the man I loved. I didn't fear him and his cruel words, even though it embodied him. Probably spoke his true feelings. I wasn't fazed by them. Sean, my husband, a murderer, was dead and couldn't hurt anyone else, not even me. Sean's apparition raised the nightmare's pickaxe. It came out of nowhere. It went to swing it. Before it could, I grabbed the wooden handle, and with all the strength I had left in me, "I have me," I said, looking into the eyes of my dead husband's doppelganger. I thrusted the pickaxe from its hands and hit it in the head. It was Sean who fell to the floor, but on the ground the thing, the nightmare, lay still. Blood started to spill from its skull, and it trickled like a stream into the dirt. It took me a while to find the original trail we'd come upon. I limped down it, aching all over, pain stabbing my nerves. After a while, I found a signal and called 911. When I eventually got to the bottom, the rescue team were there to meet me. I took one last look at the landscape of Grasmere Mountain. In the night sky, it looked haunting and deathly. They never found Sean's body. I had always heard about how beautiful Colorado was at this time of year. I guess that would be considered a subjective opinion. To a South Texas guy like me, braving these types of temperatures was anything but beautiful. "Mark, are you still in there by the heater? Get your butt out here and eat some breakfast with the rest of us. We have a big day ahead of us." That was my wife, Cynthia. As you can tell, she is an absolute ray of sunshine in the mornings. I called back towards the opening of the tent. "Right away, dear. We wouldn't want your 5-star continental breakfast to get cold." "What was that?" she shot back. Nothing. Be right there, love." I pulled on yet another layer of warm clothes, almost successfully recreating the look of a kid in a Christmas story who can't put his arms down. I took in one last moment of that sweet heater and made my way out of the tent with the others. The view was incredible from the side of the mountain. We weren't far up, but today we would be making our furthest push yet. I looked up at how far we had left to go and shuddered at the thought of it. As I sat down next to Cynthia and our friends Josh and Christina, I was handed a big plate full of scrambled eggs and potatoes with a steaming hot coffee to go with it. I chuckled the way I do when I know I am about to get myself in trouble and glanced over towards Cynthia. "You know, honey, when I said we could be a little more adventurous, I meant that maybe we could get some handcuffs or a new toy." She punched me hard in the arm, causing me to spill a bit of my fresh coffee, but grinned all the same as Josh and Christina burst out laughing. They were used to my unique brand of humor, and it was not out of the ordinary for them. Josh finished his last bit of eggs and looked up towards me, pointing with his fork. "You think you got enough layers on there, Mark?" I smiled at him and took a sip of my coffee before replying, "Bite me. Not all of us have lived outside of the 100-degree humidity of the Gulf Coast in our lifetime." He laughed a bit before getting a bit more serious. Okay, I get it. But you really might want to make yourself a little bit more mobile. We have a pretty intense day of hiking ahead of us. You might not be so cold after we get moving." "Yeah, okay, thanks, Dad. I'll keep that in mind." I fired back at him as I lifted my coffee, visibly shaking from the cold. Christina and Cynthia stood up together and headed towards the tents to gather our supplies. After I was sure that they were out of a direct earshot, I leaned in so I could question Josh privately. "So, you're sure that we'll be fine, right? I'm definitely not what you would consider an experienced hiker, or even an outdoorsman for that matter." Josh grabbed me by the shoulder, reassuringly, and answered in a similarly hushed tone. "Mark, you guys have nothing to worry about, buddy. Seriously, Christina and I have run through these trails dozens of times over the years. When up here visiting family, I would not have invited you two to come unless I was 100% certain that we would make it up the trail with no problems." I took a big swig of the hot coffee and looked at him vaguely skeptically. "If you say so, Josh. I think it's about time to kick this pig. I'm freezing my butt off, and getting up and going might do me some good." "Ask a ninja references. Really? Let's go. Time's a waste, my friend." With this, I scarfed down the rest of my breakfast, and we all began to pack up. It was not long before we had everything ready to go. We took off up the trail, one behind the other with Josh and Cynthia in the lead. The scenery was breathtaking, like something out of a movie. Mountains were all around us, and the snow was on top of the trees. You could take a picture and send it as a postcard. There was not a thing that could match it in the world. As we rounded the corner, we saw a campsite up ahead. The tents were ripped at the sides and looked tattered. There was a smoldering fire, so there must have been people there recently, if they are not still there. I caught up to Josh to see what he thought. "You see those tents? It looks like they were attacked by some bears or something." His face was grim as he responded. "It doesn't look good. I'll go ahead and check it out. You guys hang back for a minute, but keep me in your eyesight. I will wave you over when I know that all is well." I remained silent, but nodded. The three of us walked over to get a good vantage point of the camp as Josh made his way up ahead. He was approaching a tent when I noticed a body on the ground, and then another. There were red stains in the snow, and the camp was a massacre. "Josh, wait!" I yelled out as I went sprinting towards him. He turned back towards me. As I pointed towards the bodies on the ground, I was cut short before I could explain. The sound of gunshots in multiple succession rang out. He grabbed at his torso, looking at me in terror as he fell to the ground. I covered my mouth to keep myself from screaming and stopped my advancing movements. Christina let out the most pitiful and heart-wrenching sound that I had ever heard. Just as I was about to start running in the other direction, I heard something that I could not comprehend. "Shit! No, I'm so sorry! Oh my God! What have I done?" There was a man whose face was as pale as the snow kneeling over the top of Josh's motionless body. He held a gun at first, but he placed it on the ground next to Josh. He was clutching his face for a moment, but then, as Christina wailed, he looked up in shock. He saw me first and then looked past me to Christina and Cynthia. I saw the panic in his eyes as he looked at us and the body. He called out towards us. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do this." As he finished calling out to us, he stood upright and bolted in the opposite direction. I yelled at him, "Wait! Come back!" He did not look back once and turned a corner without another word. We all made our way over Josh's body. He was motionless, and the snow was stained red beneath him. Christina sobbed while holding him, and Cynthia held on to her, trying to give whatever consolation she could. I decided that I should check around the camp. I picked up the gun, which was just used on my best friend, and checked the magazine. The man had emptied the gun. I tossed it aside and steeled myself for the horrors I was about to witness. There was a man face down next to the smoldering campfire. It appeared that his throat was slashed. A woman was a bit further from the camp, and she had a large knife sticking out of her back. I walked over to the tent cautiously. making sure to approach from the side of the opening. As I drew near, I grabbed the flap from the side and slowly pulled it open, waiting to see if there was any noise from within. As I pulled the flap open, I heard what sounded like a small child whimpering. I poked my head in front of the opening and saw a boy holding what I assumed was his dead mother and crying almost silently. He looked up at me in fear and spoke in a wavering voice. "Please, mister, don't hurt me. My mommy needs help. You aren't with the bad man, are you?" I looked at his mother that had no color in her face and had multiple stab wounds in her stomach. I spoke to the boy in a calm and reassuring tone, although I, myself, felt anything but. "Hey, little guy, why don't you come with my friends and me? We'll take care of you and make sure that we bring some help back for your mama and everyone else, okay?" He looked very wary at the offer and squeezed his mother tightly. "Only if you promise you will get help from my mommy. She got hurt by the bad man, and she won't wake up." "I promise, buddy. We will do everything we can." His eyes welled up with tears, and he held his mother for a moment longer. He then gave her a kiss on the cheek before getting up to come with me. "Okay, I will come with you." He came to the opening of the tent and came close beside me. I patted him on the back and pointed in the direction of Christina and Cynthia. "Let's go over to them. That is my wife Cynthia and our good friend Christina. She has someone who was hurt and needs help as well." I didn't have the heart to try and explain what death was to the child. I definitely didn't want to let him know that nobody who was lying cold in the snow or in a tent was coming back no matter how much help we got them. He had been through enough for now. "Christina, Cynthia, this is..." The boy chimed in with his name on cue. "Loken. He was in that other tent, and I told him he could come with us to go and find some help." Cynthia answered as Christina was still beside herself over Josh. "That sounds like a plan to me. I think we could all use a little bit of help right now." Christina spoke in a wavering tone as she continued looking down at her beloved husband. "Yeah, let's get out of this place." She stood up, and we began to walk towards where we left our supplies at the vantage point to the side of the camp. Loken's little voice called out as he was running back towards his tent. "I forgot my favorite toy. I'll be right back." I was wary of this at first, but we were not going far, and there was nobody near the campsite. I kept an eye on him until he made it to the tent and then turned back towards our bags as we started to grab all of our stuff. A high-pitched scream rang through the area as Loken was running as fast as he could back to us. He had a superhero action figure in his hand, and he looked as distraught as when I found him by his mother. As he made his way to us, he pointed back towards the camp. "The bad man was there. When I came out of the tent, I saw him. He ran behind that cliff over there." I looked towards the camp without going any closer. I noticed that the knife had been removed from the back of the murdered woman. This was all confirmation I needed. "We need to run. Let's go." I picked up Loken, and we all took off in the opposite direction. Luckily, the killer had ran uphill and left us a clear path to head back down the way we had come. We ran for as long as we were able to. We even made it past the site of our previous camping area. Eventually, the weight of our gear became too much. I set Loken down and tried to catch my breath, and we all dropped our gear for a rest. There had been no sign of the killer since we left the site of the bloodbath. We were all exhausted, so it was a minute or so before anyone said a word. Christina was the first one to break the silence. "I really need to go to the restroom. I don't feel safe, though. Can somebody please go with me over to those trees?" I looked over towards the patch of trees and responded, "I'll go with you in case he is hiding in there somewhere, Cynthia. You can stay here with Loken and scream to us if you see anything. Try to call for the police. Hopefully, they can meet us at the bottom of the mountain. Okay, you two be careful though, please." I nodded back to her grimly and then kneeled down to reassure Loken. "We'll be right back, alright, buddy? Cynthia's gonna keep a good eye on you while we are gone, okay?" Loken looked scared, but he nodded his head and held on to Christina's hands. I led Christina over to the wooded area and looked around in. There was nobody within eyesight, so I let her know that she was good to go while I kept watch. Not long after she began to go, I heard a scream that sounded like Cynthia, followed by a high-pitched wailing, which was definitely Loken. "Shit! Let's go!" Christina quickly finished and pulled up her pants, and we took off in a mad dash to get to them. They were in the same spot as when we left, and Cynthia was on the ground with a hand pressed against her eye. Just about when we arrived, her arm went slack. Then, her whole body went limp. As soon as we got there, Logan was talking a million miles a minute. The man came running back from the trail and stabbed Miss Cynthia right in the eye. We were both so scared. He then ran off into the trees on the side, right past where you guys were. Logan pointed a shaky finger toward an area almost directly to where Christina and I had just been. The man had just killed my wife. The time for running was over. I told Christina to wait with the boy and the body of my dearly beloved wife. I took off with Fury driving me every step of the way. I was running, and then I realized something right before I made it to the trees. No footsteps were heading in this direction in the snow. My blood ran cold as I turned back and screamed, "Christina!" She looked up in fear from Cynthia's body, where she was kneeling on the ground. That's when a tiny arm reached around from behind her holding a large bloody knife. Before she realized what was happening, Logan had slit her from one side to the other. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stood there in shock as I watched the last member of my group tumble to the ground in a heap. I ran towards them, not even sure of what I would do if I caught the little brat. He had disappeared by the time I made it to the bodies of Christina and Cynthia, and I didn't have the strength to chase him even if he hadn't. I was overtaken with grief, regret, sorrow, and so many emotions that I had almost hoped that the little demon would just come back and finish me off too. I crawled over to my Cynthia and I collapsed on top of her. When I made it to the bottom of the mountain, the police were not there yet. Cynthia never got the chance to call them, I was sure. Once I got them on the phone, it did not take them long to arrive. They warmed me up and took down my story. I was waiting with them so long that they found the guy who shot Josh at the beginning of all this madness. He apologized over and over, but after what I had seen, I reassured him that I understood that I did not blame him for what had happened. Something he said confused me as he spoke about what had happened at the site. That little boy just came out of nowhere. I don't know what in the world possessed him to do something like that. I cocked my head up from the hot tea I was given by paramedics. That kid told me that he was there with his mom when we found him. Y'all aren't family of his? God, no. I didn't know what kind of sick Michael Myers thing that boy has going on, but none of us even had any kids. We were here on a couple's trip, a lot like what it sounds like you guys were doing. I just hope they find him before he puts anyone else through this kind of tragedy. My heart skipped a beat as I thought of the implications of what he had just told me. Where did this boy run off to? What was he doing at this very second? I shuddered as I thought of it. I stared off into the cold distance and felt just that. Cold, alone, and terrified of where Logan might be lurking. Thanks for listening, Wolfpack. If you want to submit your own story, the links for my email and subreddit will be down below. I've also created a Discord, so if you want to join that, the link will be in the description down below as well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And with that said, have beautiful nightmares, and I will see you next time.